unfortunately has not yet been translated, but which just appeared this year in April. And again, I've only brought the cover because, as you can see, it's extremely thick. It is in fact 1,700 pages. But because it's 1,700 pages by this German historian Marcus Osterliga, this is a book which really is, well, almost a 360-degree perspective. So this book is, in my view, the most comprehensive. It presents the most comprehensive view of the whole picture. So if you want to look at the causes of the First World War, if you read German, then you can get it already, but hopefully it'll be translated in the not too distant future. And this book really shows us that it supports, in a way, it supports Clark's picture, because it shows us that the Russians were involved, the Germans were involved, the Austrian-Hungarians were involved, everybody was involved. But it also shows us particularly that the Western powers, the English-speaking powers, were very much responsible for the First World War. So these are some of the various books to look at. Right. Now, what I'd like to do, just having introduced you to those things, to those books, because it's important, I think, for us to know where to look. And it's important for us to see how the picture we are given by the establishment, by the publishing world, is narrow, is one-sided. So it's important if we go to a bookshop and the main book which we want to read is only the same book, which I mentioned, right? Max Hastings' Catastrophe, in the English-speaking world, and he presents this one-sided picture, Germany and Austria-Hungary. And we can ask ourselves, why is that? And then we have to remember, I think, these important words from the novel by George Orwell. From the novel by George Orwell, those people who control the past control the future, and those who control the present control the past. This is a famous English novel written by one of the most famous English novelists of the 20th century, and it's about a totalitarian dictatorship. And the title was 1984. It was written in 1948, I think. Anyway, this is a quote from that book. And what it's saying to us is, if you can tell the people what their history was, you can tell them, this is what we were, and this is what we are now, and this is what we should be in the future. So you can therefore justify, you can support an idea, you can give the people a certain idea, if you are the government, you can put an idea in the minds of the people, this is what our country is. So the people then all go, yes, this is what our country is, and they can be more easily taken in a certain direction. Now in Britain, one of the main directions in which Britain has gone, we could say, is the direction symbolized by this particular myth. And that's the myth of George and the dragon and the princess. So St. George is the holy warrior who fights against the evil monster and rescues the beautiful princess from the evil monster. And this is a myth. I mean, as you know, that you have the Red Cross here, and that's the symbol of England as well, on the English flag, not the British flag, but the English flag. And this is a myth which has deep roots in English society, and it's a myth which politicians have used again and again in order to try to get the British people to support them, to get the British people to follow them in a certain direction. So we see, for example, 2 days after the war began, on the 6th of August, the Times newspaper said these things. The British people are drawing their collective sword in the good old cause, for the good old reason, like we did before, in the past, against Spain, against France, yeah? In the past centuries. And now, in 1914, we are doing it again against Germany. And in 2014, we are doing it against Syria, and we are doing it against Iraq, and we are doing it against, yeah? This myth of who is the princess who needs to be saved, and we are a noble country, and therefore we have to save the princess. So, for example, today, we have to save the moderate Muslims of the world against the fanatical Muslims. This is the message which is given through the media, through the official propaganda to the British people today. The myth, and it's this same, basically, it's this same myth. So the good old cause, and they talk about Wellington and Nelson and Waterloo, Oliver Cromwell, I should mention that in Ireland. But that's what that you mentioned, you see. Oliver Cromwell beating the Spanish, Drake and Howard, and all these heroes from British history. And they're saying, well, in this war in 1914 against Germany, we are defending the cause of the weak against the strong. The cause of the small peoples against their overweening, overpowerful neighbours. The cause of law against brute force. The cause of the Commonwealth of Europe.
What was that?
Interesting phrase. Against the domination of the sword. So Britain was a peaceful country which believed in law and peacefulness and harmony and Commonwealth, and Germany was a autocratic, vicious, nasty, aggressive, military autocracy. However, when they wrote this, of course, they forgot a few things. They left out a few things. For example, this is 1914, so they forgot that not only did they forget that women did not have the vote, women were put in prison who wanted the vote, women were forced to eat if they didn't want to eat, if they were protesting. The men in Britain at the time, the political class, did not tolerate any opposition by women who were protesting for the vote, for equal rights for one half of the population. So Britain was in no way a democracy at that time. Secondly, they forgot that in 1906 the British Army had killed a number of people in an uprising in Egypt, which was the Denshawai incident. They forgot that there were the ongoing problems in Ireland. They forgot that in 1904 the British Army had invaded Tibet. And the British Army had killed about 2,000 Tibetans with their ultra-modern weapons against the Tibetans who were using these old-fashioned guns and so on. The British Army invaded Tibet, but nobody talked about that in 1914. They forgot that in 1899 and 1902, the Boer War, the British had used 450,000 troops to suppress the Dutch farmers, the Boers in South Africa. Why? Because we wanted the gold and the diamonds of South Africa. And we were determined that the Germans should not have them. So we were determined to take the two provinces of South Africa, which were controlled by the Boers, who were themselves racists, but then so were we, And so we decided to take those two provinces from them. That was the Boer War. But that was all forgotten. And in the Boer War, the British developed for the first time the concentration camp. And in order to control the Boer guerrillas, the British arrested the wives and the mothers and the families, the females of the Boer families and their children, and put them in concentration camps. And over 20,000 died. That was forgotten in 1914. And then we forgot, of course, in 1898 that the British fought against in Sudan, in Africa, where again, using the most ultra-modern weapons, Winston Churchill was also a soldier in this campaign, the British completely wiped out with machine guns their Sudanese tribesmen. It was the war against the Sudanese. Yeah? Now, I could go on and on, you see. If you go right back to 1871, which was when Germany was united and became one country for the first time, and you look at how many wars did the British fight during this time? Well, please, check it out for yourself. It's many wars. Many wars. Some big, some small. And then there were also indirect wars which we financed, like the War of Japan against Russia, which we fought, which we supplied the battleships, and we supplied the money. Yeah? So, the British were involved in many wars, but Times said, we are the peaceful people fighting the law against brute force, and so on and so forth. So the use of propaganda, you see. Now, in this period, from 1871, when Germany became one country, until 1914, when the First World War began, Germany fought no wars, zero, except one, which was a relatively small, ugly, because these wars are ugly, nasty, one small war it fought in Southwest Africa, the colonial war from 1904 to 1907. That was not a pleasant war, which the Germans fought. But that was their one war during this time, unless you're going to also talk about what the Germans did in Beijing in 1900. But that was not only the Germans, that was all the European powers and the Americans. They all fought against the Chinese in 1900. Yeah? So we can't say, well, that was the Germans' fault only, because all of the European imperialists were involved in that action. So if we compare Britain and Germany in this period, we see, well, quite clearly, the Germans were involved in very few wars at all. And the British were involved in quite a few. But that was all forgotten in 1914. Now, on that basis, I'd just like to show you something else. Because before I come to talk about one particular family, and this shows us something of the very unusual history of Britain, which is this book here. Now this is a funny book which came out a few years ago called All the Countries We Have Ever Invaded and the Few We Never Got Round to by Stuart Laycock. Yeah? So it's slightly humorous, but nevertheless the facts are so. Now please don't imagine that this map shows you that the British invaded and conquered all these countries. They didn't. But they, in some way or other, the British attacked all these countries. These countries they did not attack. Mongolia, Chad, Bolivia, yeah? Mali, and so on. The Vatican City, they did not attack, for example. Monaco and other such places, yeah? But all the countries in red, the British either conquered, controlled, or attacked in some way or other. Yeah? Well, it's quite remarkable, don't you think? I don't think any other country in the history of the world has this record. So you have to ask yourself, why? Why? What is special about this tiny little, I mean, look at it, it's very small.
Yeah.
What? So I shouldn't point to Ireland here, should I? Just point to Britain there. Just point to Britain. This is very small. England, not Scotland even. Very small. Eh? Now why is that? And we see that from the 1 year which people know in the history of Britain, which most people in Britain know, because history is usually very boring in school, so people don't remember dates, for example. But there is one date which people usually remember in Britain. Can you guess what that might be?
1066.
Indeed, 1066. Most people know this. Most people know this date, yes, and that is the date when Britain was invaded, or England, I should say. England was invaded by the Normans, who came from Normandy in France. Yeah? But originally, they didn't come from there. Originally, they came from
Scandinavia.
yeah, mostly Denmark, and probably with a Norwegian leader, which means Vikings. Yeah? So, in 1066, we see that Britain was invaded, actually in two directions. It was invaded directly from Denmark, from Norway, by the Norwegian Vikings, who we can say are 100% Vikings. And then it was invaded from the south in the same year by semi-Vikings. People who were second generation or third generation Vikings. They had some civilization, as it were, some civilization from the French Latin world of the continent. Right? So they were Christian now, they followed the Pope. The Pope even encouraged them to invade England in 1066. And they knew how to organize, they could build castles, they exchanged their Viking ships for horses, so they were cavalry and so on. Yeah? But they still had the quality of will which the Vikings had. Because you don't change a nation so quickly. Nations do not change their character so quickly. Yeah? So these Vikings coming from the south, the Normans, had a tremendous quality of will. Before this time, England was, of course, controlled by the Saxons, the Anglo-Saxon people. It's just interesting to see that in the centuries, about 4 centuries, 400 years, when the Anglo-Saxons were controlling England, it's just interesting to observe the fact that the English did not invade the continent. The English did not invade Ireland. The English did not invade Scotland. The English did not even invade and conquer all of Wales. Yes? But then, after 1066, what happens? We find that the Normans, first of all, they go to Ireland, 1171. Then they go to Wales, 1280s. Then they try to conquer Scotland. That fails. And then, after that, the continent, France. 100 years they try to conquer France. Think about that now. You try for 100 years to keep on conquering France. Eh? Finally, because of Joan of Arc, gradually they're pushed out of France. They have to give up. And then they say, where shall we go? They decide to conquer the whole world, more or less. And so we find that in 1900, before the First World War, this very small little island here has this huge big empire with this enormous navy and this enormous capitalist financial system of control. Quite remarkable, eh? You have to ask yourself, what is that? How on earth does this happen? And what is the relationship between this drive to do all this conquering and the royal family and the aristocracy and the people who led the country? Now I'd like to show you something else here. and that is that we see our dear Prime Minister, David Cameron, because this lecture is not only about the First World War, it's about the connection between the First World War and today. Yeah? David Cameron gave a speech on the 19th of November 2012 to the Confederation of British Industry. That means the top British businessmen in London. And these are some of the things he said in the speech. And he says, speaking to the leading businessmen, we need this buccaneering, deal-making, hungry spirit. Britain is in a global race to succeed. International competition. We are, the people in this room, that's business people, we are fighting to win. The world is breathing down our neck. You, business people, you need us to be tough, radical, and fast. Because all this language, you see, is the language of war and competition. We're having an all-out war on dumbing down. In this global race, you're quick or you are dead. We are fighting back hard. When this country was at war in the 1940s, everything was thrown at the overriding purpose of beating Hitler. So again, that's the other thing, see? Well, we need to do something, we have to remember Hitler always. Because Hitler's always the enemy. Churchill, Hitler, 1940. This country is the economic equivalent of war today, and we need the same spirit. Now this spirit which he's talking about is the spirit of the buccaneers, the pirates. Because as I'm sure you know, that's how the British Empire started. The British stole the gold and the silver of the Spanish and Portuguese. That's how we began. Yeah?
That's a great story.
It's a piratical spirit. And then, as we became a bit more intellectual in the 18th century, 1776, The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith, he develops this into a new business and economic philosophy called The Wealth of Nations. And the basis of that philosophy is competition. Competition between individuals, competition between nations. And as I said earlier, that philosophy itself of capitalism, modern capitalism, is based on materialism as a deeper level philosophy. So we're not in this world, in this life, to help each other as brothers and sisters, as fellow human beings. We are in this world to fight against each other. And some of us must survive, and some of us must go under. So at this point, I would like to give you an illustration of that, just so you can see how the connection between today and 1914. I think this is really important because, you see, if we don't change this fundamental way of thinking, then we are in for serious problems in the 21st century, which might even lead, for example, between a new East-West struggle, or perhaps even war, between, for example, the West and China, which is now developing its own capitalism as a philosophy of business. National self-interest. So the British economic philosophy of the 18th century was personal self-interest. And then the personal self-interest became national self-interest. So now it's not just me fighting against you, it's my nation fighting against your nation. Because we want that. And you're not going to have it. No? And I know that sounds rather crude, but basically that's what it is. We want the gold and diamonds of South Africa, because with this gold and diamonds of South Africa, with this geopolitical location of South Africa, which is very important in the world, this geographical position, we can achieve great things for our empire, not yours. Yeah? This fundamental selfishness. This is the official song from the London Olympics, 2012. You see the words. And notice here, put these two lines.
Why on earth did those two lines in?
Exactly my question. That's exactly what I was just going to ask you. What are these two lines doing here in a song which is supposed to be about sport? I won't forgive, vengeance is mine. What's that doing there? I mean, it's bad enough as it is. If you look at the spirit of this, I'll never lose, I'm sure to survive, you won't pull their head, I'm going to fight, and so on, you know. It's bad enough. But these two things, what's that doing there? But these are the words and the sentiments which went out from London through the television, through the internet, all over the world as representing the spirit of Britain today. And that is the spirit which David Cameron wanted to take hold of and then use to, hello, broadcast to the British people and say, this is us today. You see? So it's about telling a story to the people. This is us. This was us before, 17th, 18th century, buccaneers, pirates, empire builders, and now it must continue to be us in the future. Yeah, and then if we go back to 1914 and we see just one moment.
Remark on how different that the song is to the Gloria Estefan Olympic song of the last American Olympics, which was Reach.
Reach for the stars.
Indeed. Wait a minute. What I'd like to show you now are 3 articles which appeared in an English magazine. Oh, here we are, I think. Oh no, that's not that. No, that's not that either. 3 articles which appeared in an English magazine in the 1890s. Now this was before the Germans began to build a navy. And you see that what we have here is basically the same sort of attitudes about competition as we could see in that song which I just showed you. Just a moment. And this magazine was called the Saturday Review, and it was a well-known magazine. It was a weekly magazine, and yeah, here we are. This magazine was, many famous people wrote for this magazine. And in 1895, 1896 and 1897, 3 articles appeared in this weekly magazine. So you've got to imagine say the Irish equivalent, where all the most famous people in Ireland would write for this magazine. And in these 3 years, 3 articles appeared in this magazine, written, they were anonymous, so we don't know who wrote these articles. Or at least we didn't know then. Since we know now who wrote 2 of them. But we don't know all of them. The first one appeared in 1895. The magazine was called Saturday Review, and it was called Our True Foreign Policy. And I won't read all of it to you, but I just want to focus your attention on these words here at the bottom. It says, "We English have always made war hitherto upon our rivals in trade and commerce, and our chief rival in trade and commerce today is not France, but Germany. In case of a war with Germany, we should stand to win much and lose nothing, whereas in case of a war with France, no matter what the issue might be, we stand to lose heavily." And the first part, what it is saying, it is suggesting that Britain should change its traditional foreign policy to an anti-German policy. Because in the 19th century, Britain's foreign policy had traditionally been anti-Russian and anti-French. They were the imperial rivals across the world, so they were the enemies. The partners, or the friends, so to speak, were Austria and Turkey. Yeah? Not allies, but at least sort of friendly countries. Yeah? And then from the 1880s onwards into the 1890s, this began to change. And these articles were telling the people what the change should be. The change had already been decided on some years before by the people at the top in the elite, and I'll come to that in a minute. But this is just an example of how that was put out through the media of the time. That's 95. Now, this is the time, 95, where there's a major crisis in South Africa. Remember, the gold and the diamonds in South Africa, and the very important location in the world, geographical location of South Africa, which the British felt we must have this. We must have South Africa, and we must have Egypt, Suez Canal. Why? Because these two places are absolutely necessary to control India. And India was the key to British economic and world power. Right? So the British ruling class always felt that the British must control India if the empire is going to continue. And one of the top British elite people, Lord Curzon, said in 1900 that if the British lose India, we fall straight away to the rank of a third-rate power. So we must keep India at all costs. So 1895 is the beginning of tension between England and Germany in South Africa, because German investors also wanted to invest in the gold mines and the diamond mines in South Africa. And the British were worried that the Germans would become more efficient and more competitive than the British in South Africa. The next year, we see February the 1st, 1896. Now this tension is now even worse in South Africa. Another article, again anonymous, called A Biological View of Our Foreign Policy. Biological view by a biologist. Yeah? Now why is that? Because remember, social Darwinism looked at politics, looked at social affairs, human beings like animals, no different. So seeing how do nations follow the laws of biology according to Darwinism. So this philosophy was invading the social and political realm. Now what does it say? Let's look at this in more detail. Of European nations, Germany is most alike to England. In racial characters, in religious and scientific thought, in sentiments and attitudes, the Germans, by their resemblances to the English, are marked out as our natural rivals. In all parts of the earth, in every pursuit, in commerce, in manufacturing, in exploiting other races, the English and the Germans jostle each other. Germany is a growing nation expanding far beyond her territorial limits. Well, not in Europe. She's bound to secure a new foothold or perish in the attempt. Were every German to be wiped out tomorrow, this is very non-PC, you wouldn't say this today, yes? Were every German to be wiped out tomorrow, there is no English trade, no English pursuit that would not immediately expand. Were every Englishman to be wiped out tomorrow, the Germans would gain in proportion. Here is the first great racial struggle of the future. Here are two growing nations pressing against each other, man to man, all over the world. One or the other has to go. Now, please take a step back a minute. Just imagine this in the present context. Unthinkable, yes? This kind of language today. But in those days, no problem. Because it was the norm. Because this kind of social Darwinist thinking completely pervaded the intellectual elite at the time. So, one or the other has to go. One or the other will go. The biological view of foreign policy is plain. First, federate our colonies and prevent geographical isolation, turning the Anglo-Saxon race against itself. So all the English-speaking countries must come together in one community, in one group. Federation. Second, be ready to fight Germany. Why? Germania est delenda, which is Latin. That's Latin, the language of ancient Rome, because as we know, all of the intellectual elite in those days learned Latin at school. So they all understood Latin. Germania est delenda, which means Germany must be destroyed. Now, if you know your Roman history, and I can well understand if you don't, then you will know that this phrase comes from the Roman orator, Cato, or Cato, who was a great public speaker, you see. And exactly. Exactly. So in those days, Rome was fighting against Carthage, which is another big city. And Rome was the land power, and Carthage was the sea power, the naval power. Right? So Rome and Carthage were fighting against each other. And Cato used to finish every speech he made in the Senate by saying, oh, and by the way, Carthage must be destroyed. And that's what they did. So the Romans fought 3 wars against the Carthaginians, and in the end, Carthage was totally destroyed, right down to the soil. Every building completely destroyed. So this is what they are repeating in England, in this famous magazine, 1896, Germania est delenda. Third, be ready to fight America when the time comes. Lastly, engage in no wasting tears against peoples from whom we have nothing to fear. Let's look at the last article. 1897, following year, England and Germany. In Europe, there are 2 great irreconcilable opposing forces. 2 great nations, sorry, that's a spelling mistake. 2 great nations who would make the whole world their province and who would levy from it the tribute of commerce. England, with her long history of successful aggression. That's something to be proud of. With her long history of successful aggression, with her marvellous conviction that in pursuing her own interests, she's spreading light among nations, dwelling in darkness. This is how they used to speak in those days. And Germany, bone of the same bone, blood of the same blood, because after all, the Anglo-Saxons are a Germanic people, with a lesser will force, but perhaps with a keener intelligence. Because the Germans are clever in science and technology, you see. The British were worried about that. They compete in every corner of the globe, wherever, and where has it not, the flag has followed the Bible and trade has followed the flag. There, the German bagman, salesman, is struggling with the English peddler, salesman, businessman. Is there a mind to exploit a railway to build, a native to convert from breadfruit to tin meat, from temperance to trade gin? Temperance, of course, means no alcohol. The German and the Englishman are struggling to be first. 1 million petty disputes build up the greatest cause of war the world has ever seen. This is 1897, not 1914. If Germany were extinguished tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, there is not an Englishman in the world who would not be the richer. Nations have fought for years over a city or a right of succession. Must they not fight for £200 million of commerce? Yeah? It's quite naked, isn't it? Quite naked. When our work is over, we need not even be at the pains to say to France and Russia, seek some compensation. Take inside Germany whatever you like. You can have it. Why? Germania est delenda. Yeah? Now, again, remember, this is a leading British weekly magazine, like The Economist today. Only it's not about economics, it's about all aspects of social life, this magazine, Saturday Review. And this is what they're saying in the 1890s. Now, in the next year, 1898, the Germans announced that they were going to start to build a navy. But before that, in these 3 years, 95, 96, 97, the Germans had no navy. But already, there was some Englishman who was saying, Germania est delenda. Germany must be destroyed. And who were they? These guys. We know today that the first article originated from a faction in the English Foreign Office, which was directed by this man, Eric Crowe. He was the senior clerk in the Foreign Office. So that's like a kind of middle level, at those times, middle level, senior middle level civil servant in the Foreign Office. The 1896 article, we know, was written by Sir P. Chalmers Mitchell, Professor of Astronomy and Biology. We know that because in 1939, I think it was, he actually admitted that in public. Men were the head and front of the anti-German party all along, vexed, angry at our surrenders to Germany and persuaded that Germany planned our ruin. Between them, they made the German peril the central feature of our foreign policy. Well, thank you very much, that's helpful to know, because this man, Reckington, he knew, he was a top correspondent of the Times with connections to everybody in the news world, journalism world at that time. So we know from him that these men who joined the Foreign Office at that time were very important individuals in the development of this new direction, anti-German direction, which we'll see leads on to the First World War. However, these were still lower level people. There were still people much higher than them. Who were they? Who were they? Let's have a look. And then take a break. Yeah? So, what shall I do? 5 minutes?
Do you want to start with this?
Or shall we stop that and then continue with that after the break? Yeah? Okay, so these are the middle level people, we can say, in the government who are responsible for this new direction in British foreign policy, which moves Britain away from its traditional enemies, France and Russia, and now against Germany, and towards its traditional enemies. So from this time onwards, the British elite are beginning to say, how can we connect with France and Russia? How can we make our enemies our friends, our allies? Because in fact, France and Russia are the big dangers for us. Germany is not really a big danger for us. Germany is not really against our interests. But we shall see that Germany was the target of France and Russia. So if Britain wants to ally itself with France and Russia, then Britain has to accept that Germany will become an enemy, because France and Russia need to fight against Germany in order to achieve their national goals. Yeah? Whereas Germany is not really a great threat for British national goals. And what we saw with these articles is a way to convince the British, particularly the middle classes, that Germany is a danger. Whereas in fact, Germany was not truly a danger for Britain. The elite knew that the real dangers for Britain were France and Russia, particularly Russia. So the foreign policy had to be completely changed. Yeah? And so after the break then, we'll look at, well, who are the people at the top who were really deciding why this foreign policy had to change, which then was sort of spread through these people and then spread through their contacts in the media. And then led Britain on into the First World War.
Maybe,
yes.
After it, maybe
and then questions.
talk a little bit about what you've said so until now.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Because,
Yeah. And I just want to, because we've got somebody from China here, that you will probably be interested. You'll probably be interested in this gentleman. Yeah, Sonmu. Because if you look at this article written by him in 1917, you'll find very, very interesting things which he says, which help us to understand how the British Empire worked and how the British directed their foreign policy. Yeah? An interesting key in what he had to say.
yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. So we'll take a break. Made peace with Spain. And you might think, oh, wonderful, they made peace, it's a nice thing to do. But the English people did not want to make peace with Spain. The English people wanted to fight the Catholics, because the English people said we're Protestants and proud of it, and we have to fight the Catholics. You see? That was their attitude. So, whereas these people were looking, as it were, into the future and saying, we cannot control America, we cannot see our ships doing trade and business and commerce all over the world if we are fighting with Spain, because we're not strong enough to do that. So we have to have peace with Spain, even though we don't like the Spanish because they're Catholic. Yeah? So we have to have peace with Spain in order to be able to send our ships across the ocean and do business with everybody. Like Asia, for example, where the real money was to be made. Yeah? And if we want to have colonies in America, and maybe we can find gold in America, which the Spanish have also found, you see? This is how the thinking was going. Yeah? Where can we get wealthy from the new world which is opening all around us? The whole world was changing in those days. Yeah? Like space travel, almost, literally. I mean, space travel on the planet. Yeah? So they made peace with Spain. Not popular, it wasn't popular. But in the long vision of the history of the country, you can see how important that was. Yeah? America, India, Japan, Russia, Persia, all these places. Yeah? You see the English ships began to go out there. First colonies, most important, planted in America. The first factories, trading posts planted in India, and so on. So, that was the 16th century, 1600. And by the way, the other big important thing they did, somebody mentioned James Bond and 007, right? Well, these are the people. So 007, you know, was a real person. And he was an agent. And he worked for him. He was his boss. William Cecil. Lord Burleigh is his title, right? And 007 was the code name of John Dee, who was a mathematician and a geometrician and a cryptographer interested in secret codes and so on and so forth, and an occultist interested in magic and all sorts of things, talking to angels and what have you. Yeah? And he worked for him. So these two men created the beginnings of the English Secret Service. Ian Fleming, who wrote the stories of James Bond, he knew the history of the Secret Service and how it originated at this time, under Elizabeth I and James I. So keep that in mind, please. Secrecy, intelligence networks, and global power is connected with his family. Now that's at the very beginning of the chapter of England's imperial expansion. And then what do we see? At the end of the chapter, or let's say the beginning of the end of the chapter, 1900, we find, once again, the Cecil family are in power. Only now it's uncle and nephew. Lord Salisbury and Arthur Balfour. Yeah?
Very quick question.
Just write those names up.
Did the Union Jack come in with James I?
No, came the
Union Jack came in with James I, except of course for the Irish. It was not the Irish, the Northern Irish flag. No, it was just, yes, he invented the Union Jack consisting of the Cross of St. George and the Scottish. Yeah,
because it's present form at the Act of Union with Ireland.
That came in 1801.
Yeah.
Okay, so Lord Salisbury here, and Arthur Balfour, his nephew. So this is 1900, right? And they were then Prime Minister, he was Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary, very secretive. Very secretive man, mysterious, secretive man. But these guys were real minds, you know, these were particularly him, philosophers. They were scientists, amateur scientists. They were researchers. They were interested in psychic research. Very broad interests. And these are the men who, particularly him, starting with him. This is his son, by the way, not quite so important, but also significant. Robert Cecil. In the 1880s, it was with this man in particular, as Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary at both posts, both positions, And they were the ones who began to see British foreign policy has to change, as I said before. So change away from Germany, Austria-Hungary and Turkey, and towards our traditional enemies. You know, we have a saying in English, if you can't beat them, join them. Yeah? If you cannot beat them, join them. But the joining can be like this, good friends, or it can be sort of friends, not real friends. Yeah? And that's what he had in mind. So let's get close to the Russians in order to control them better. Yeah? And he carried that on. And so gradually, from the 1880s until 1907, we see this change take place over 20 years in British foreign policy. It's a diplomatic revolution that these guys carried out. And its influence went through the media, and you can trace that quite easily, and you see who represented these kind of views in the media. And also, I'll just mention, though I haven't got time to go into it tonight, that this same idea that Britain's future has to get close to France and Russia, that was also shared by the Prince of Wales, who later becomes King Edward VII. Edward VII. He's very important in all this. Edward VII, he was king at this time. 2001 to 1910. And so, outside the government, you had the king, or the Prince of Wales, as he was for a long time, and the circle around him, who were also pushing in many different ways to move British foreign policy in this new direction. And then inside the government, they were doing what they could to do the same thing, but they had to go slowly, do you see? Because as I said, that at this time, this is not popular with many people. In those days, it was not popular to make peace with Spain. In their time, it was not popular to make peace with France and Russia. Because for 100 years, French and Russians, well, longer with the French, had been the enemies of England. Do you see? So that was deep-rooted in the people, suspicion of France and Russia. So they had to go at it rather slowly, behind the scenes in many ways. Yeah? Now let's look at, well, this, by the way, is the latest. So they're descendant, member. And I'll just mention, his name is Viscount Cranborne, here. Viscount Cranborne. And if you look into him, it's just interesting to see, well, what he's been doing in the last 20 years. But I don't have time to go into that now. You can Google it. Viscount Cranborne. So he's the descendant of Lord Salisbury, the Marquis of Salisbury family. Okay, now this family, they're connected to all the major ultra super rich families and influential traditional powerful families in Britain through marriage or other relationships. Yeah? So very important, the Cecil family. Okay, now this is, I want to draw your attention to. This comes from the historian John Charnley in his book Splendid Isolation. And here's Salisbury, Lord Salisbury, the same man I showed you just now. And in 1885, he says to his friend, Sir Robert Morier, who was something of an expert on Russia and Germany. So he understood a lot about Russia and Germany, Robert Morier. And Salisbury says to him, Russia's only weak point is her financial embarrassment, her financial weakness. So if we become her chronic enemy, it is to that weak point that our efforts must be addressed. So we must use Russia's weakness, financial weakness, to get at her. Yeah? And we must lead Russia into all the expense that we can. In other words, we must make Russia pay out lots of money in various ways. Why? So that a few steps further must push her into the revolution over which she seems constantly to be hanging. So Russia is, they could see that Russia is in a very unstable situation socially, and if we play our cards right, then we can push Russia into social revolution. Now please think about this. These are aristocrats. These aristocrats planning this, and they're planning how can we push Russia into socialist, Marxist revolution? Now Salisbury, Charlie notes, Salisbury wanted three things, or he imagined three possibilities. How can Britain deal with Russia? Yeah? Because remember, from the time of these guys, Britain is expanding all around the world. But on the sea, on the oceans. But at the same time, Russia is expanding over the land. So Britain is becoming a sea power, and Russia is becoming a massive land power. And sooner or later, these two will meet. And that took about 200 years before they met, yeah? After the defeat of Napoleon. And after the defeat of Napoleon, the British elite go, aha, who is now the big problem for us? And their answer was Russia. And why? Because they could see that Russia was slowly moving in the direction of India, which was for the British, it was we must keep India at all costs. And the Russians were moving in that direction. So from 1815 and the defeat of Napoleon, the British began to look at Russia as their main enemy. They'd always looked at France as their enemy. Now a new one was Russia. So Salisbury thought three things. How can we secure the road to India? How can we keep India safe from the Russians? And he thought, well, time and chance might provide the answer to the Russian problem in one of three ways: revolution, Islamic revival, or war against Germany. Now you think that's quite remarkable. This is 1885. Revolution, Islamic revival, inside Russia or on the borders of Russia, and war against Germany. How can we get Russia involved in one or maybe all of these things? Well, has that not happened? Hasn't that happened? Since then, all of those things have happened. In fact, all of these things happened even in the First World War. Islamic revival also happened in the First World War. Yeah? And the beginnings of what we see today in the Middle East really started in the First World War. Everybody's heard of Lawrence of Arabia, right?
Yes.
Everybody's heard of Lawrence of Arabia. Who has heard of Captain William Shakespeare?
Captain William Shakespeare.
Captain William Shakespeare.
No.
Probably nobody in this room has heard of Captain William Shakespeare. Yes? No. I'm not surprised. But the only difference between Captain William Shakespeare and William Shakespeare, the dramatist, is that there is no E at the end of Captain William Shakespeare's name. So the spelling is the same but without an E, right? Now what did Captain William Shakespeare do? Well, we know that Lawrence of Arabia, he made the connection to the Hashemite Arabs, the Hashemite family, which is today the kings of Jordan, right? So he made the connection between the British government, the British elite, and those Arabs. Captain William Shakespeare made the connection between the British government and, surprise, surprise, the House of Saud. So Captain William Shakespeare began the process of sending British guns, and British money, and British supplies to the House of Saud so that they could win their battles against the other Arab chieftains and tribes in the region, because the British identified the House of Saud as the probable winners in that battle. And why did they want that? Because they said, we have to get the oil in Mesopotamia and we have to protect Suez Canal. Who can do that for us?
During the First World War.
Yeah. Who can do that for us? And they identified the House of Saud. And then Captain William Shakespeare unfortunately got himself killed in 1916 at a battle where the Saudis were fighting, which is one of the reasons why we haven't heard so much about him. But I think the other reason why we haven't heard about him is because you may know that the House of Saud, who later made the country Saudi Arabia, in fact the country is named after them, right? I mean, imagine a country called O'Connell Island or something. But that's what Saudi Arabia is. It's named after a family. Yeah? And so that family came to power in Arabia as the most powerful country. And that was because of the backing they received from the British. But if you look into the history of that, you find that that family had for a long time been identified with a particular spiritual stream. And that spiritual stream is the Wahhabi stream of fundamentalist Islam. Right? And it's the stream of fundamentalist Islam, which of course is now interested in creating all kinds of interesting developments, shall we put it that way, in the Middle East. Yeah? And one of the things, of course, which they're interested in creating is a caliphate. So to recreate the caliphate, one Islamic state, one Islamic religion. Yeah? Now the British made that possible. Now can you imagine the name of Britain's greatest poet and dramatist is somebody who is actually intimately connected with fundamentalist Islam? Maybe this is why we haven't heard too much about Captain William Shakespeare. But so it is. Yeah? Anyway, Islamic revival. So these are the three ways in which from this time the Cecils began to see how can we involve Russia in the First World War. Now I must just come finally to show you that how important the British came to regard not so much Germany but Russia at the time of, in the years from the 1880s until the First World War. Because it was really Russia that they wanted to remain friends with, as it were. Just a moment. That's, sorry. That's really great. I lost it. What we find, even on the eve of the first, just before the beginning of the First World War, we find that the leaders of Britain at that time were determined that Britain should stay in very close relationship to Russia and be prepared to engage in any wars that Russia wanted to be engaged in. Here we are. So here, for example, we see Charles Harding, who was one of the top civil servants, the number 2 in the Foreign Office, and Sir Edward Grey, the Foreign Secretary. He was a man of almost no experience in foreign affairs before he became Foreign Secretary. And yet, he became the Foreign Secretary for the longest period ever in the history of the Foreign Office. From 1906 to 1916, 10 years. He was in the Foreign Office. No foreign languages, couldn't speak any. No foreign travel, really, to speak of, only a tiny little bit. No interest in foreigners or foreign affairs. Well, why would you, or English sort of thing. That's sort of attitude. But no, seriously, you have to ask yourself, why? Why was this man chosen at an absolutely important time in the 10 years before, 8 years before the First World War, to be the Foreign Secretary? Now, under him, number 2 was this man, same man, Charles Harding. He's exactly the opposite. He was a man of the world. He spoke all the foreign languages. He knew the foreigners. He was close to the king, King Edward VII. Yeah? So he was like the minder in a certain sense. He sort of took control. I'm not saying he controlled Edward Grey. He wasn't like a puppet master. But shall we say, he kept Edward Grey on track so that he would continue in the desirable policy. And I've already described to you what the desirable policy was. The desirable policy was to develop an informal relationship with the French, which they did in 1904, and then an informal relationship with the Russians, which is the real target, 1907. And his government did that with the Russians. Now what did he think? He said, we have no pending questions with Germany, so no outstanding questions with Germany, except the question of naval construction, building battleships. While our whole future in Asia is bound up with the possibility of maintaining the best and most friendly relations with Russia, we cannot afford to sacrifice in any way our entente, friendly relationship, with Russia, even for the sake of a reduced naval program by Germany. And then we find, here's our ambassador in St. Petersburg, our ambassador in Russia. Well, he again is basically very close to Harding. Harding appoints his successor, which is Nicholson, who carries on the same policy as him. These three guys all believe in the same thing. Here is Sir Edward Grey, who was going blind at that time, hence the dark glasses. And we find that Harding, so again, that's him, yeah? Harding writes to Nicholson. If a promise to render material assistance in the event of war were invited by Russia and refused, it's almost inevitable that Russia would be compelled by her military weakness to come to terms and to modify her attitude towards the aim of the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary. So, we must not allow Germany and Russia to get together, is what he's saying. That was absolutely crucial for the Brits. Buchanan, this is Buchanan, ambassador in St. Petersburg. Buchanan writes to Sir Edward Grey, the Foreign Minister, March 1914, it's useless for us to blind our eyes to the fact that if we are to remain friends with Russia, we must be prepared to give her our material as well as our own moral support in any conflict in which she becomes involved in Europe. Any conflict. Nicholson, remember this is Nicholson, so he's now the new number 2 after Harding. Nicholson writes to Buchanan, ambassador in Russia, I am also, April, a month later, I am also haunted by the same fear as you. Lest Russia become tired of us and strike a bargain with Germany, the Russians could seriously shake the British in India. This is to me such a nightmare that I would, at almost any cost, keep Russia's friendship. And finally, Grey, the Foreign Secretary himself, only 1 month and a bit, well, almost 2 months actually, before war begins, yeah? The war began on the 4th of August. Grey writes to Buchanan, unless the situation in Persia is remedied, is solved, and that soon, so unless we solve the problem in Persia, that's a problem with the Russians in Persia, by the way, unless we solve the problem with the Russians in Persia, the whole policy of Anglo-Russian friendship on which Her Majesty's government had built and which was the cornerstone of their foreign relations would come to a disastrous end. So you see that these key people in the foreign service were absolutely focused on our number 1 priority is we must stay sweet with the Russians. Because if not, they will become so powerful and they will become a threat to India which we simply cannot cope with. And in order to stay sweet with them, we have to be prepared to go to war with Germany, even though it will be painful. Because in the longer run, they thought, war with Russia would be even worse for us. We would lose India. And that we cannot do. Germany is no threat to India, at least not yet. So, why did the Russians want war with Germany? The Russians wanted war with Germany because they wanted war with Austria-Hungary. And Austria-Hungary and Germany are like this. Okay? So why did the Russians want war with Austria-Hungary? Because the Russians wanted two things. Well, three things actually. They wanted Constantinople. They wanted the city of Constantinople for religious and cultural reasons. They wanted the Straits of the Dardanelles. Yeah? The Straits of the Dardanelles, that's, have I got a picture of that? You know where that is? In modern Turkey, isn't it? Modern Turkey. Yeah?
Access to the Mediterranean.
Yes, exactly. They wanted access to the Mediterranean for their exports, particularly their agriculture. It was very important for them to get into the Mediterranean. And thirdly, they wanted to control, they wanted to produce a kind of dominance over the countries of the Balkans. They wanted to create a kind of Balkan federation of the Slavic peoples, Bulgaria and later Serbia and so on, these countries who were also Slavs, like the Russians. And the Russians wanted to lead this. So it's like mother hen and her little chickens. That's how they saw it. Our younger brothers. We are big brother and they are little brothers.
They still see it like that.
Yeah, to some extent. That's how they saw it in those terms. There's again a racial feeling. So they had those three reasons. And that meant they had to destroy the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Because there were many Slavs inside the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And Germany was not going to allow that, because Germany and Austria-Hungary were friends. So, war was inevitable. And then France, what did France want? Russia and France are like this, yeah? Allies. What did the French want? They wanted Alsace-Lorraine. Yeah? And Germany had taken Alsace-Lorraine after the Franco-Prussian War in 1871, which France started. The Germans were stupid to take those two provinces, it should be said, because they made problems for themselves in the future. But the war was started by the French, you know. So the question then is, again, Germany is not going to give those two provinces back. So how is France going to get that back? The French were planning and dreaming and imagining for 44 years how to get those two provinces back. And the way that the idea that they had was us and the Russians, and the Germans are in between. Yeah? Franco-Russian alliance, 1892, 1894. Between these two, Germany can be smashed. And then France can get Alsace-Lorraine back, and we can get Constantinople, the Dardanelles, and our Balkan League from the Austrians, who are Germany's friends. I hope I haven't lost you.
No.
And all that, yeah?
But at school we were, obviously, you're saying it's a lot that Bismarck sort of manipulated.
Yeah, of course, of course.
Yes,
Yes, of course, yeah. And there's some truth in that. But the point is, remember, the French regarded themselves in those days as Europe's top power. It's all about national glory and national pride, you see? So the French were not happy about Prussia because they saw Prussia getting stronger and they thought, well, the Germans, they need to be put in their place. So Napoleon III, he didn't mind going to war against Prussia. That was just the French vanity, really. And it's, again, it's a question of national vanity and national pride. Yeah? But anyway, what I'm trying to emphasize here is the goals, the national goals of Russia and France could only be satisfied by war. The goal of Serbia, what was the goal of Serbia? Russia's friend. Yeah? The goal of Serbia was the same. Serbia wanted to create its own Balkan League or South Slavic League federation controlled by itself. No? Mm-hmm. How was that possible? It was only possible if the Austro-Hungarian Empire would be destroyed. So Serbia gets together with Russia, big brother, and they began to plot and plan how to bring about the destruction of Austria-Hungary. So the goals of Serbia, Russia, and France, these three, could only be achieved by war. The British goals, as I've already said, could only be achieved by war, because the British wished to bring about revolution, or they wished to bring about a weakening, even a destruction, if you like, of Russia. They wished to bring about a weakening, a considerable weakening of German commerce and the German navy. And these goals were not achievable without war. So a war had to be provided. And the British, as I've said, were prepared to accept this war with Germany if they could maintain a friendly relationship with Russia. That was the main concern. And then in the long run, to bring about in Russia the socialist revolution, which I have already referred to. And you can find that all described in quite some detail in, I'll just refer you to that, in a series of lectures by Rudolf Steiner, which he gave in 1916 and 1917. He goes into tremendous detail in all of these various plans, called The Karma of Untruthfulness. There are 2 volumes of these lectures, 25 lectures altogether, which he gave in Switzerland at a very important moment in the First World War. And one of the key ideas in all of that was that Russia should become a socialist state. And here you see this funny little picture here, which was actually a cartoon. And the cartoon is this here, which emerges in Britain, Christmas Day, 1890. And this cartoon, I haven't got time to explain it all to you, but basically it's a cartoon about a hypnotic dream, which came out in this magazine, again, an elite, a magazine run by a very rich man in England. And the magazine was called Truth. And it's the Christmas Day edition. And the Kaiser is the Emperor of Germany. He had only been the Emperor for 2 years at this point. Still a young man, 31 years of age. And in the dream, they wanted to know what the Kaiser was thinking. And so they wrote a long poem in the dream which describes what the Kaiser is thinking using hypnosis. So they use the power of hypnosis to find out what the Kaiser is thinking. And what he's thinking, imagining, is that he will go to war against Russia. And a future European war will emerge. And out of this war, and this is Dawn's story, here the Kaiser is born and so on and so forth. And eventually he goes to war, he looks like Napoleon, 1812. And then the result of the war is that all of the kings and queens of Europe will have to go into the workhouse, so bye-bye to the monarchies of Europe. And Europe will look like this at the end of the war. And Europe will become republics. So all the monarchies will disappear. And you see British Republic, Swedish Republic, Austrian Republic, French Republic, so on and so forth. But look at Russia. Russia will not become a republic, Russia will become a desert. Yeah? That's the intention for Europe, for Russia, after the end of the war, according to these members of the British elite, already in 1890. Yeah? So it's really very much Russia which the British are focused on at that time, and how to bring about a war which can lead to, here for example you see Germany split up, it's German republics, not republic, and Russian desert. So the weakening of Germany and the weakening of Russia. So those are the sort of long-term goals. It's interesting to see that already in the 1880s and the 1890s, the British elite have this vision of the 20th century. And the last thing I'll just very, very briefly mention is that at the same time, in order to bring this about, what's very, very important is that Britain should have the financial support of the United States. So the British realised that we have to get together in an alliance with the United States, which they already begin to plan at this time. And you begin to see many British aristocrats marrying rich American women, for example. Winston Churchill was a case in point, yeah? His mother was American. So, America, they decided, America's support was absolutely critical in this war which was coming up. And we see various ways in which the British elite begin to get close to the Americans at this time. And in the dream I just showed you, this dream here, the two people who are identified as having magical hypnotic powers in British politics, the powers of hypnosis to control people, are the Prince of Wales, later King Edward VII, and Lord Salisbury. So these are identified as the two important figures, and these two would be able to control or read the mind of the Kaiser, just like they could read the mind or hypnotically control various people in British politics. And that's all described in this long poem in Truth magazine in 1890. I think I'll stop there. I hope just giving you a sort of flavour of the kind of the long-range thinking which the British, a bit like the Vatican.
Would you briefly touch on how the EU fits into this?
How what? The Vatican? The EU? Oh, the EU. Yeah, okay. I can very quickly do that. If you just bear with me 1 second, I can certainly very quickly do that. Just a minute now. And this makes it very clear, I think.
Britain didn't come out of the First World War very rich, did it?
Sorry?
Britain didn't come out of this First World War very well, did it?
No, but basically Britain handed over to the Americans in the First World War. So the English-speaking people, and remember, the elite of the American, the East Coast elite especially, the American East Coast elite, they were very Anglophile.
They were?
Very Anglophile. Not the West Coast elite, the East Coast elite.
Did you realise that most of the aristocrats in Britain were in deep financial trouble?
Oh, indeed.
40 years.
Well, that's why, as I said, that's why they married these rich American heiresses. Indeed. Britain was certainly having financial problems. Hang on a second. Now, here we are. It seems we're talking about the European Union. Just a minute. Where's he gone? Mr. Here we are. Right. The European Union. Winston Churchill gave 3 great speeches about United Europe. 1947. London. The creation of an authoritative, all-powerful world order is the ultimate aim towards which we must strive. Unless some effective world supergovernment can be set up and brought quickly into action, the prospects for peace and human progress are dark and doubtful. But let there be no mistake upon the main issue. Without a united Europe, there is no sure prospect of world government. It is the urgent and indispensable step towards the realization of that ideal. So the European Union, European Federation, European superstate is the beginning first step of world control. And who do you think is going to exercise this world control? Well, of course, people like him. The Anglo-American elite. And coming from the Catholic side, because it's not only the Anglo-Saxon Protestants who are doing this, but from the Catholic side, you have from the 1920s onwards, this man, Count Richard Kuznova-Karagi, who founds the Pan-Europa movement. And in 1947, he's cooperating with Churchill, because he also has deep connections not only with all of Catholic aristocracy, Catholic Europe, but also with the Anglo-American elite. You can look into all of that online if you like. A very interesting person. At the heart of Europe, we have met in open conspiracy, to use the words of H.G. Wells. The purpose of the conspiracy is to organise immediately across Europe the parliamentary majorities that will be strong and stable enough to impose upon governments the full implementation of our programme, which is the European Union within the framework of the UN.
So it sounds like something that the UKIP would use at their rallies. Like from an Irish perspective, it's just hard to understand.
Yeah, but it's the opposite, the UKIP, isn't it? Because what he's looking for is...
Yeah, but like they would use that to frighten British people.
What they were frightened to, yes, exactly. But the point is that they should use it, in a sense, but they don't. UKIP don't use it precisely this. UKIP don't talk about Winston Churchill as an architect of the European Union. Why not? Because Winston Churchill is a conservative right-winger. And UKIP is also a conservative right-wing party, you see?
So to ask an impolite question, how do you vote if there's a referendum in Britain?
September 2000, Daily Telegraph, conservative newspaper. Euro-federalist financed by the CIA. So this is explaining how the CIA, back in the 1950s, were already financing what we today have as the European Union, the European Economic Community as it became, and then later on developing the Union. The Americans were deeply involved in this whole process from day one. Why? Well, let's just finally go a little bit into that, and then I really must stop.
It looks very different from here.
Sorry?
From Ireland's perspective, it looks very, very different.
It looks very different from Ireland.
It seems that Britain has difficulty treating smaller nations as partners and equals, and that's the crux of their unease with Europe.
Okay, this man was a very influential editor, progressive thinker, social reformer, 100 years ago, 120 years ago, very deeply connected. He knew many people in the elite. He had a great amount of influence in all sorts of directions, which I don't have time to go into. One of them was that he trained and recommended this man, the editor of the correspondent of the Times in Berlin, to go to Berlin, and eventually this man was one of the main anti-German propagandists working for the Times from 1897 until 1908. This man was one of the main architects of British connections with Russia. He worked for a closer relationship with Russia in the media from the 1880s onwards. Right? Now, what does he write in 1899? He writes a book called The United States of Europe. The United States of Europe. On the eve of the Parliament of Peace. And he writes something interesting in this book. He says, in order to found the kingdom of heaven, it's necessary that you must have an effective working devil. Where are we to find an adequate devil to overcome the force of inertia as well as the more effective elements of national rivalry and race antipathies so as to bring about the federation of Europe? The other element which is lacking is a central power sufficiently strong to compel the recalcitrant states to come into the alliance of the United States of Europe. So the English-speaking elite, and I realise I'm making a jump here because time is short, but an important part of their thinking of the 20th century was that Europe has to be brought together in a kind of federation which can be subject to the English-speaking peoples. And in this world, the Catholic world must become English. The Pope must speak in English. The Pope must think in English. Yeah? Because he was dreaming of a kind of caliphate, actually. He was dreaming of a British Empire controlling the world in which the whole rulers would speak and think in English, and this would be a political, religious entity. That was his dream, that was his imagination. And he says, if Europe can be accustomed to practically unity, it will in time bring about the United States of Europe, which will be nonetheless welcome because it will be born of mutual fear and distrust rather than brotherly love and neighbourly confidence. So in other words, quite prepared for this United States of Europe to come about through war. Yeah? We need not be surprised if the United States of Europe only gets itself into material existence after considerable bloodshed. And one could go on with these various things. This is his book called The Americanization of the World, or The Trend of the 20th Century. These are people who feel far into the future, do you see? For far-reaching goals. This is his book, Americanization of the World. He believed in this. And by Americanization of the world, he meant control of the world by people who think and speak in English. Racism. It's racism.
But English is becoming the language of the EU.
Yeah.
So why are the British elite
Sorry?
Why are the British elite so phobic about it at this point? Like, I mean, the Pope will, in another few decades, the Pope will speak in English and think in English.
Yeah, and then probably the Roman Catholic impulse will disappear.
So why is there this, like, deep distrust of...
Well, again, it's on the part of these British elitists from the 19th century, their imagination was that unless the world is controlled by English-speaking people, there will be no peace in the world. I know that sounds absurd, but that's sincerely what they felt.
I think the question he's asking Terry is, why does it seem on the surface that England don't want to be part of Europe?
Yeah.
Why does what?
I think what he's asking is, on the surface,
Yeah.
it appears that England don't want to be part of Europe.
No. England wants simply, the British elite simply want Europe to do what we want them to do.
Yeah.
It doesn't want the European Union to break up.
It's a kind of they're playing a game in the media.
They're playing a game in the media.
They can look like they're not involved in Europe.
None
of
the leaders of the British political parties want Britain to leave the European Union. None of them. Cameron is now talking as if he might, but he doesn't. And why not? Because all of the leaders of the major British corporations, including the Japanese, all want Britain to stay in Europe. Cameron knows that British industry is not going to suddenly resurrect over the next 5 or 10 years. That's not going to happen. That means British industry is still dependent on foreign, for example, like Japanese companies are now Chinese companies, and Arab money and so on. Basically, all these people need Britain to stay in Europe.
Yeah, basically Anglo-American interests are controlling and influencing Europe.
Well,
no, it doesn't look like that.
Indeed.
In the media, it looks like Germany is doing it, but they're under the...
Well, the German elite are basically just doing what the American elite tell them to do.
Yeah, so...
I mean, you
But Britain is going to leave.
Sorry?
Like, it looks very like the uneducated masses are going to leave.
How anything appears isn't what's actually going on.
Quite. Well, that's what I said to you before about the Cecils, remember? The British people wanted to fight the Catholics. But the Cecil said,
But if
in 1900, the British people wanted to fight the French and the Russians. But the elite said, we're going to get close to the French and the Russians. And you know about this. You know that right now what's going on is the attempt to connect America and Europe. You also know about this, that Trans-Pacific Partnership, America is attempting to connect to Asia. Why? Because they're preparing to oppose Russia and China, which are connected together in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So basically, just like Germany was encircled by the French and the Russians and the British 100 years ago, now a massive global encirclement is taking place of the Chinese and the Russians, who are the land powers, and they are being surrounded economically by the sea powers, the traditional sea powers. America, Britain, Japan, they are surrounding Russia and China. That's what's going on. Because they all share this selfish form of economic philosophy. So the root is this problem of we have no morals, we have no real morals or ethics in our economic life. And that's what has to change. Otherwise, there's going to be war. That's how I would see it later on. And if you think, well, you know, that can't happen because the countries are also connected. We all depend on each other economically. Well, in 1910, one of the greatest economists, economic writers of the time, Norman Angell, he wrote a famous article and then a book in which he said it's impossible for modern countries today, 1910, to go to war because we are so economically dependent on each other. 1910. 4 years later, they go to war.
So there will be a referendum, and it's supposed to be an in and out referendum.
That's what they're saying. But a lot can happen between now and 2017.
There's a deep, visceral, almost hatred of Europe, it seems, amongst the majority of British people. So if there is a referendum, the Commission's up to a referendum, people are going to vote out.
In 1914, there was a deep, visceral hatred between Protestants and Catholics in this island, in Ireland, right? And if you look at what happened in 1914, you see how cleverly the British elite kept the pot boiling of hatred between the Catholics and the Protestants in Ulster. So there was a major, major political crisis in Ulster in 1914, and it looked like there was going to be civil war. But in fact, the British elite were actually controlling both sides of that problem. In the gun running that was going to the Catholics, in the gun running that was to the nationalists, and the gun running that was going to the Protestants. And they kept that pot bubbling right up until the beginning of the war on the continent. Yeah? And we can ask ourselves the question, what is the relationship between that bubbling pot in Ireland and the war on the continent? And as soon as the war on the continent started, the bubbling pot in Ulster disappeared. Of course, it didn't disappear in the nationalist community, because then 2 years later it leads to rising. Yeah? But with the Ulster, with the Protestants, the whole thing just disappeared. And yet for a year, they had kept that pot boiling.
Because there's someone else to hate for a while.
Yeah, but I just mentioned that one thesis, and I can only say it's a thesis because I haven't really had time to investigate this yet, because this has only come out recently. But in this book, for example, the thesis is presented, that the idea is presented, that this was basically what was happening in Ireland in 1914 was Plan B for the First World War. Meaning that if Belgium had not happened, the British needed some other excuse to go to war with Germany. Now, who was providing the guns?
Germans, yeah.
To the Protestants and the Catholics. Well, we say the Germans, but who actually did that deal? Who were the gun runners? Who were the people in Hamburg who supplied the guns?
Crooks.
No, not Krups.
No, the agents.
These are small weapons. These are rifles and machine guns, not howitzers. Who was actually doing that? One needs to look into that and see what were the connections between those people in Germany who were supplying the weapons and the British establishment. Erskine Childers, who did the gun running for the Catholic side.
Yeah.
What was he about, actually? What happened to him in August when the war began? One has to look into that. Yeah? I'm just saying that that's the interesting thesis one has to look into. If the Germans had not gone into Belgium Britain could not have gone into the war, do you see? They would have no excuse. But they wanted to get into the war to support France and Russia, so they would need some other excuse to come into the war. So they need a plan B. The plan B, according to this hypothesis, was Ireland. But in the end they didn't need it, because the Germans did go into Belgium, you see? That's an interesting hypothesis. Have a look into it. Anyway, at that point,
Thank you very much.